And I think we're at a very interesting point here because I think legal is figuring out, okay, unlike your traditional GDPR, anti-bribery and corruption training, we need people to actually know these things so that they can apply them, because the tools we're giving them are omnipurpose. They can be used for so many different things. And if they don't understand where the risks are, they're not going to flag it. They're going to use it for things that perhaps weren't anticipated or not sensible. But to control it from a technical perspective, unless you're in a large corporate and you have quite heavily regulated technology or environment, it's also quite difficult.
We're going through something absolutely historic.
Technologies across the board are growing exponentially.
It's a disruption that's going to completely redefine the way businesses compete.
In the next decade, we're going to lose 40% of today's Fortune 500 companies.
The exponential growth of computing is continuing.
AI is nowhere near its full potential.
Whether you like it or not, that the future cannot be stopped by anyone.
Welcome back to the Future Tech and Foresight podcast. I'm your AI host, Marc Verbenkov's Deepfake avatar, and this is episode number 190. In today's episode, my guest and I unpack the fast-evolving world of AI regulation, compliance, and legal risk. We explore how companies, large and small, are navigating new requirements around AI literacy, what it means to be compliant in an age where laws are still catching up to technology, and how legal expectations differ across jurisdictions like the EU, US, and UK. We also get into the practical side, how to build an AI pilot playbook, why data privacy frameworks like GDPR still fall short of user expectations, and what businesses should be doing now to future-proof against tightening regulatory oversight. Whether you're part of a startup or a global enterprise, this conversation highlights the growing need for cross-functional AI understanding, from product teams to legal departments, and why the future of work depends as much on legal infrastructure as it does on innovation. Now a little bit about the guest. Erika Werneman is a seasoned legal expert with over a decade of experience at the intersection of law, data protection, and emerging technologies. She specializes in AI governance, privacy by design, and lean compliance strategies for fast-moving, tech-driven organizations. A former head of privacy at a high-growth startup and recognized as a rising star by Legal 500, Erika is also a leading voice on AI literacy and regulatory readiness. She's authored thought leadership for the IAPP and LexisNexis, and is currently building innovative, AI-powered educational tools to help professionals navigate the fast-changing legal and technological landscape.
Hi there, Erika. Thank you very much for joining the podcast. It's great to have you on here today to talk about AI literacy, how businesses are starting to pilot some AI things, and I think we'll get into laws and regulation and compliance, which I think I'm very interested to hear about. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So how did you get involved in the work that you're doing right now? Was it kind of like an interesting event that came up, or was it kind of a natural, organic process that brought you to this work?
Yeah, it's probably more of the latter. So I'm a lawyer by way of background. I started out sort of disputes, did a lot of technology work, and then in the run-up to GDPR, pivoted towards data protection. And there was a lot of really interesting topics that comes up in that domain. Everything from facial recognition to autonomous cars. You wouldn't think it's data protection, but there's quite a lot of that as well. So I think I've primarily been following the tech and the interesting, or what I find the interesting use cases. And I would say it's pretty recent that my practice has gone from being very much sort of data protection compliance to being primarily focused on the AI. And slightly broader than just the legal aspect. So I spent about a decade at a city law firm, and then left and went in-house and got a flavor for actual solving problems, like business problems. And I think that's I mean, even in legal teams, there's so many good use cases. So I'm playing around with building some stuff myself. And I'm clearly a waffler as well. So I think that's pretty much how I got into it. And then in terms of the work that I do, it's so broad. So I work with very early companies through to your multinationals. In case you're wondering about the accent, I'm actually Swedish. Having spent time in the Middle East, the UK, Sweden, obviously, and the US. So it's very international.
Interesting. Okay. Okay, so if you're dealing with these kinds of different various companies, sizes, types of companies, etc., and one of the things that we talked about beforehand was AI literacy. For these companies that you're dealing with, like, are you getting a sense that the AI literacy is starting to grow in these companies, or is it still very low, as is kind of the experiences that I'm having anyways with the companies that I'm over here in Vancouver, BC. So there's not a lot of AI literacy out here yet.
Yeah, so I think and I've been caught out by this before. I think before you sort of talk about AI literacy, it's helpful to understand what do you mean by that? What is your understanding of that topic? Because it has very different connotation in terms of people that are looking for business cases. And then you have your HR learning and development approach, competency, probably more than AI literacy, AI competency. And then you have, perhaps confusingly, you have actual legal requirements specifically calling out AI literacy. So you will see the concept come up in everything from your macro sort of social policies of countries to individual learning campaigns. But the topic that I'm primarily looking at it from is the intersection between the competency, so your HR learning and development perspective, and your regulatory requirement. So in particular, on Article 4 of the EU AI Act, they have the topic is AI literacy. So there is a legal requirement, so it has a definition, it has operative provisions. And if you are caught by the EU AI Act, that legal requirement kicked in about a month ago. So it's one of the first pieces to actually come into force. So if you are caught by that law, you will want to take, certainly at least in part, a very sort of compliance regulatory approach to understanding, okay, well, who am I responsible for training? What am I responsible for training them with or for? And then what are some ways of achieving what is a reasonable level of AI literacy? And that will depend on the context, on the AI you're using, on the level of sort of the type of company you're in, and having with a lot of legal requirements, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen, as far as the regulators are concerned, right? So you will want to have a very structured approach to both your assessment of what is or are your AI literacy needs across your workforce, and potentially broader than that as well, because the AI literacy needs here is for your organization, your staff, and people deploying AI on your behalf. So potentially outsource arrangements. I'll pause for a second because there's a lot of detail that you can go into, but the other point that's quite interesting around it is, whereas traditional training and compliance requirements are very much input-based, what it says in the law is that you have to achieve a certain level of understanding, and that sort of translates into an output-based assessment. Do people actually understand? It's not just a tick box, annual training campaign that you can do and done it. The intention by the regulator is certainly to drive that from sort of information into actual knowledge.
Okay. How yeah, there's a lot to. So how is this enforced for like small businesses too, or are we talking about just larger businesses that this law is implemented upon?
Right. So we're in a transition period. So the actual sort of supervising authorities, the bodies that are responsible for enforcing these requirements, haven't actually been established, and they're not going to kick in. They'll be appointed by August, and then this, depending on, actually taking a step back. So the act is a risk-based act, and different parts of it will kick in at different times. There's a 3-year sort of period where different requirement kicks in. So the first to come into force was the AI literacy and the prohibition in February. And we're now sort of on the clock in terms of your general purpose AI models, the code of practice surrounding that. And then as you go a bit further, different requirements will kick in. You'll first have your higher risk requirements, Annex 3, which is your general use cases, and then you'll have your product safety requirements in another year, so 2027. So where you are in that spectrum, it will correspond with a level of AI literacy, presumably, that the regulator will require. So for a the law doesn't regulate sort of minimal risk scenarios. That's outside of the scope of the law. In that bracket, what are your training requirements? There's no operative provisions. But then as you get into the more high risk scenarios, clearly there's going to be a lot more training requirements because they have to correspond with the risks of the actual and the legal obligation, I should say, related to the AI system. So it's it's a whole spectrum of assessing these things. But for smaller entities, it's not intended to be, I think, a particularly onerous obligation.
I've got a lot of questions from this.
Yeah, good.
Okay, so maybe taking another step back here in order to take 2 steps forward. What other similar laws have been enacted for, say, different technologies, and have there been successful? Has there been success with those? Like, was there a law like this about internet literacy, and was that successful? Or I don't know, smartphone, or like some other kind of thing across companies? Probably a
Put me on the spot there. So lawyers specialize. I have to think it. So you have so the way it works for a lot of different domains is that you have your requirements that the law spells out. But in order to get the business to live those requirements, to actually do the things, you have expectations of training. And so you see this in data protection, anti-bribery and corruption, all of your typical corporate compliance requirements. They contain either inherently or they specify a training requirement, or as is the case in most scenarios, having sufficient training will act as a defense because you took organizational measures, hopefully that were proportionate to the risks, and you can evidence that. Which is actually, that brings me on to a slight segue. I promise we'll come back around. The traditional corporate compliance training has I wouldn't say exclusively, certainly not exclusively, but largely been structured to act as a defense for regulatory scrutiny. So the intention has not necessarily to be the best at teaching, it's been to be able to have a solid defense. So a lot of the training culture that sits in companies around the world, I mean, I've been at entities that have measured their success of their training campaigns, their corporate compliance training programs, and within 2-3 week period, we're in the single digits for what people are able to recall. So it's a known that is not very good. So if you just to close out on that tangent, I wouldn't rely on traditional corporate training methods in the compliance space, certainly, to help you get to a level of understanding that you might want from a commercial practice. So here, I think there's a really interesting opportunity to actually look at, well, what are the real training needs of the business to be able to do this, to not just from a risk and harms perspective, but to take advantage of this technology, and then actually to interweave these risk-based, compliance-based considerations, because the training requirements are fundamentally here around legal compliance, possible harms, possible risks. So it's not sort of opportunity oriented, but rather than having it as a standalone piece of training, certainly what I advocate is find out what you want to do with AI, because there's so many risks, right? So if you don't know what kind of use cases you're looking for, it's very easy to either go way over the top or to focus on something that isn't actually material to your business. So by figuring out the industry that you're in, the level of sophistication, and what your strategy is, you can right size the risk aspect of that to actually address the risks inherent in what it is that you're trying to do, rather than across the board.
Yeah,
And that was the loop on that.
yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that was my real question that I wanted to ask, but I wanted to be careful because, like, I've only worked at small companies my entire life, but I've had friends that work at large companies, and like, oh yeah, I just did 2 months of training, and I don't know what the hell I'm doing now, right? Like, it was kind of wasted. So my real question was, like, how valuable is this training going to be, this literacy training, in actually producing employees that are competent with this, crazy technology? But I think you already answered
I
that.
mean, it's great question, and I'm obviously biased working in the space,
Yeah.
but I think I've never been in a scenario where I work, so I tend to support either the GCs, chief compliance officers, or people generally on the board that are trying to bring these things in. I've never been in environments where employees are proactively coming to get risk training. That's a new place.
Right. Yeah. And why would you? If it's not going to help me with my job, climb the corporate ladder, then maybe there's not that much interest. Yeah.
I'm finding also legal teams, compliance teams, risk teams, they don't know exactly how to respond to that because then they're scrambling to try to get video solutions, corporate training packages, and it's difficult to get something that is contextual and helpful for the business without doing it yourself. So the companies that have L&D departments, I think, or people that are able to customize training, I think they're probably having an easier time of it because they can speak to the subject matter expert, the legal teams, even external legal, get the points that they need, but weave it into an actual competency building exercise. And I think it's we're at a very interesting point here because I think legal is figuring out, okay, unlike your traditional GDPR, anti-bribery and corruption training, it's we need people to actually know these things so that they can apply them because the tools we're giving them are omnipurpose. They can be used for so many different things. And if they don't understand where the risks are, they're not going to flag it. They're going to use it for things that perhaps weren't anticipated or not sensible, but to control it from a technical perspective, unless you're in a large corporate and you have, quite heavily regulated technology or environment, it's also quite difficult. And we do see quite a lot, in fact, all the time, the whole issue with shadow AI, which is individuals just setting up their own accounts and using it for corporate purposes when really it's not in the corporate environment. It hasn't gone through any kind of in security vetting. It's not a entity that you have a contract with, so you don't have the data processing clauses or any clauses for that matter.
Right.
And they're introducing risks that way. So a lot of the time, the first priority is to just figure out what are we going to allow, not allow, and then try to communicate that and train people on this is the actual process for using the tools.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah. Okay. Super interesting. One other thing that is perhaps a little bit unique to AI, which I'm sure you've talked about, is the speed at which it's evolving and the speed at which its capabilities are growing. How does that factor into these AI literacy, risk and compliance ideas? If you go through, I don't know, 2 month, 1 month long AI literacy course that intertwines these ideas of compliance and risk, from my perspective, by the time you're done that, it's potentially obsolete at the rate at which these tools are evolving.
well,
Maybe not.
I mean, I think because what you want from a risk harm sort of legal requirements perspective, I think what you want to do is train people on principles of what are why does the risk arise and how can it materialize in different kinds of scenarios with different kinds of tools.
Mhm.
And that what that looks like is going to be very different for different companies. You've got everything from your regulated healthcare, where you have a lot of priority on safety, you have a lot of priority on confidentiality, and you take that to an ad agency or something like that, where you're talking about a completely different application. You're probably talking more about your Gen AI tools, automation, probably or potentially some issues around marketing consents and what you can do with personal data. Like the spectrum is so broad. I think if you figure out what's relevant for your industry, the size of company that you're in, and what you're actually proposing to do with the AI tools, and that can be everything from your top down. We have a strategy. This is what it is. We're going to train people for this, or it can be, as is the case with most companies, by the way, we don't know. We're gonna try out a couple of things. So they have more of a portfolio approach where they test in different teams, different kinds of tools. They might be building some bits themselves, they might be procuring some bits, and they have, if they're quite sort of sensible around the governance of that, they have programs for that and ways of managing sort of the pilots that we were talking about.
Yes, yes.
But for each of these, they're generic sort of the general topics that come up quite frequently around your data protection risks, around your IP risks, your confidentiality, who has access to your business information. And then depending on if you're talking product, there's product liability, there's potential consumer issues. So it's just having a think through it. A lot of the time, companies are also deploying stuff internally for employee use. And then you have your employee considerations as well to think about. But if you try to cover off, if you try to do a program around all of the conceivable risks, it would be, I think there is such a thing, right? MIT has a database that they're running. There's something like, 1,000 and something identified risks. And these aren't even the corporate risks. These aren't enterprise risks. These are just risks inherent in the technology. So I think you need to right size your efforts here.
Okay. Could you, if you can, I don't know what kind of rules you have on this, talk about the pilots a little bit more, like maybe a little bit more tangible,
Yeah.
the examples. I think that'd be very interesting to hear.
So it's on that topic of right sizing your efforts, right? So what lots of companies are doing is they're building out, it has different names, but let's just call it the AI pilot playbook.
Yep.
So it is agreed upon process for how to test out AI use cases and AI technologies. And typically, what you have here is you have your executive sponsor. So you have someone who says, it makes sense from a financial perspective. We're not going to be taking for all of these tools that we have no use case of. So you have your sort of executive, your commercial alignment of, does this make sense for the business? Does it align with our strategy? Is it financially viable? Roughly, do we have the kind of capacities or skills that we need to try this? And if not, can we source it? Can we bring someone in? And then you have that a process for the business generally. So people can put their hand up and say, actually, I have a really good use case. And you do find that people do quite quickly get very involved. You might have a board sort of appointed team or some kind of setup to lead the initiative, or it can be completely organic within the company. So you have a process then for carrying out your risk assessment, which typically involves your legal team, your compliance team, your infosec security team. And you do a light touch assessment. So rather than having the full-on process that you would have for a deployment scenario, you do something more light touch and contained. So we're going to run this pilot for, say, 12 weeks. This is the scope. These are the number of people that's involved. These are the data sets, and it's contained. Now, there is, a lot of issues taking AI use cases from pilot into actual deployment. That's separate. To just test it out. You do this to have a contained, almost like an internal sandbox before you spend time doing all of the things that you need to do for actual deployment. You test it out to see, is it actually viable? And as part of that process, legal can say there are use cases we're just not going to touch because the effort of getting the legals or the compliance piece sorted out is just disproportionate to what you want to do. So you typically have a go, no go, and then you have a light touch risk, like depending on the scenario again, but you have a risk assessment, you have risk owners, you all understand if this starts not performing well, if it's not either producing the output that we need, or if risks become apparent over the course of the pilot, we can pull the plug. So you have a process for understanding if it's gone too far, a threshold. And you probably will have a number of risks sort of listed out there are knowns that you would then want to address prior to any wider pilots. And you can do it as a proof of concept initially, and then you can do a wider pilot and then look towards actual deployment. But having, to your point around AI literacy, what you would have then is train the people that are doing the pilot, that are impacted by the pilot on these different considerations or risks. You don't have to train the whole company, but make sure the people that are doing it understand the risks inherent in this pilot.
Um, you've mentioned risks a number of times. You've mentioned the MIT database. Could you like make it a little bit more tangible for some of the audience members? Like, I've got a couple ideas in my mind, but I would love to hear from you. Like, what are some of these? Like, are there themes, trends in the type of risks that you're seeing from these pilots?
Yes, so you will have sort of enterprise, strategic and operational kinds of risk. So I'm very much on the legal compliance, perhaps a bit of reputational risk, right? There's lots of different operational risks that I wouldn't necessarily touch. But from a legal perspective, what you would be looking at are things like, if we just run through a high level example, so data protection is quite typical because GDPR, lots of stringent requirements. So you actually have inherent in those regulations some risk management aspects as well. So you might have heard of the concept of DPIAs, data protection impact assessments.
Yes.
It's essentially a process of evaluating the risks to data subjects. And that's a light version of that is sort of baked into your AI risk assessments. There's some very good, for people that are interested in the public domain, like the UK government has published, I think it's called the algorithmic recording standard. It's a form of assessment that they do when they're looking at using AI for public services, and it's quite good. So you will look at risks in the training data. How is it selected? Who owns it? Do we have the right kind of IPs? Is it representative? Is there bias risks? All kinds of different things through to the model, how that was done, the deployment scenarios. And where I tend to get involved is the impact. So what kind of risks are inherent in the impact? And it could, if you're looking at an internal scenario, it could be the impact on leaking employee data across the business. If you're integrating stuff in Slack. So leaking confidential information, privacy concerns, intrusiveness, and then to the point around the predictiveness that we were talking about before, which is inherently more high risk. When you're using personal data to try to predict future events, if they have an impact on what we call life opportunities, so access to employment, as your CV screening, your recruitment tools, education, so exactly the same CV screening, but for educational institutions, access to credit, insurance, all of these different things have an impact on life opportunities. So they are very much what we would, in Europe at least, would look at as quite high risk scenarios. So I wouldn't want someone to be running a pilot with any of those use cases. They are on the excluded list in terms of pilots that we would be looking at least, unless you are a recruitment company and this is the core part of your business,
Right.
you'd need to look at it, right?
Right.
So for those different scenarios, when I work with very techie people, a lot of the risks will be IP oriented. So if you're building AI and you're taking code from open repositories like GitHub, etc., what lots of people don't realize is there's typically a license associated with that. And if you're introducing into your products IP that is subject to these open licenses, depending on the type of license here, you don't actually own the IP that you're creating. You're required to make it public. So you can introduce risk into your products by not having your IP position sorted out. That can happen at different points in the value chain as well. So you can be at risk of being sued if you're using IP that you don't own. That's pretty
pretty substantial, really. Sorry to cut you off. I mean, you spend, however many months or years putting together a product, and oh, by the way, you can't actually own this thing. Like, that's pretty substantial. Yeah. Has that happened? I haven't heard of that.
I mean, there's several lawsuits against the big model providers. They're on kind of IP infringements for their training, and then they use copyrighted data to train the models, so the models are in breach of intellectual property right. Like, there's a lot of that going on.
Yeah.
That for most, like, smaller businesses, they outsource that risk to the market. If everybody else is using the model, we think we're pretty okay doing it. But you can take a model and fine-tune it on your own training data. And so educational institutions occasionally will, look to use textbooks. Do they own the textbooks? Because the concepts they want to teach are not necessarily, nobody owns the IP in a mathematical model that's been around for 2,000 years. If you looking at quite basic maths, but the actual copyright in a textbook, somebody would. So what you're training, if you're doing fine tuning, if you're training yourself, so what you're training it on will be quite important, and understanding the IP rights on that. That's then separate or complemented by your data protection rights, because certainly in Europe and the UK, you have to look at, can I actually do this with the personal data? And here, the regulators have come out with all kinds of different guidance around, you have to have your lawful basis, your retention requirements, secondary purposes. Is this the purpose it was collected for? Is this something completely different? There's a lot keeping me busy, basically. So I didn't want to spend the whole session talking about legal risks. And the point isn't to make people paranoid or frightened about it, but just having temperature gauge on where you're at and your risk exposure will help also settle some nerves if you're not thinking about doing anything very crazy about it. But if it's an inherent part of your strategy, of your products, I would definitely make sure I have a very solid understanding of the legals there.
Very interesting. Yeah, what a wild world we're moving into, huh? Um, uh, okay, so I think we've talked about like kind of a larger macro discussion here with regards to like companies as a whole. How about if we dive down a little bit towards specific individuals within companies?
Mm.
So, um, there's we have some points here that we shared back and forth about potential ideas or tips for individuals in their careers about like how to the term here is future proof their careers with AI skills, right?
Mm.
Um, I mean, I can talk about this all day, but this isn't my podcast time to speak. So I'm more than happy to hear what you have to say about this.
Oh, I actually think you wouldn't be in a very bad position if you actually leverage some of the earlier thinking around how to be very structured and intentional around your learning. So we were talking about it in the context of companies designing this to meet strategic/legal requirements. I would say that's a pretty good tactic for individuals as well.
Mm,
You will have an understanding of the nature of your role, and potentially, hopefully, an idea of how AI could potentially impact that. So you could almost take a two-pronged approach where you can look at the opportunities and the risks. And if you were the person in your team that had a solid understanding of the risks as well, you'd probably be legal's best friend. Like you would have some very helpful knowledge there. And in a lot of companies, we're building out they have different names, but your AI champions network, your AI governance network, and you also have, in some companies, sort of your more formal committee style with rotating employee representation. So I think having an understanding of how these things work at a corporate level can help you understand at an individual what are the immediate skills that will be in demand? It'll be harder, I think, to predict long term, but you can take a step-by-step approach and start with the basics and then build on that and couple your opportunistic sort of understanding of use cases and scenarios with a little bit of an understanding, well, what is it that companies are concerned about in terms of using these? So you could have quite thoughtful conversations on those topics. I think that would be a really good idea. I think this then, from my perspective personally, I'm also very interested in understanding I have a son, right? So understanding how this is going to play out in terms of education, in terms of how children might interact with the technologies. So from a parent's perspective, there's other areas that I'm looking at because I'm curious and because I feel like I need to know. So I think you can probably sketch out quite readily, what are a number of topics that you think are relevant for your career, and what are a number of topics that you think are relevant in your personal lives, or what are you interested in
Mm.
understanding? So there's societal issues, misinformation, disinformation, all of these different things. They'll be very much augmented by AI, but I think it's also really helpful to get a grip of and understand how can you be manipulated? How can it play out? And just having a bit of a curious mind around these things.
Couldn't agree further with you. Have you seen any conflict between individuals who want to kind of go as fast as possible with developing their AI skills and testing things within companies versus the kind of compliance and the laws and the regulations or company policies that are saying like slow down, we need to understand the risks, like you can't be doing that. I could imagine, you mentioned champions network or champions within a company. These are self-motivated individuals that just want to use any kind of new technology, in this case AI, as much as possible, and they might be hitting like walls or barriers where the company is, I think rightly so, concerned about some of the risks that you were mentioning.
Oof, for sure, plays that all the time. What's interesting to me is that the legal sphere, where lawyers are traditionally quite risk adverse, they're actually doing a lot of interesting things with AI, which is probably to do with the incentives, the business models. But I feel like there's also because there's a lot of people with expertise right now, one of the best sort of safeguards that you can have in terms of certainly Gen AI output because of hallucinations and inaccuracies is someone who really knows the domain. Because you can, if it's something you know really well, you can spot quite easily where it's made mistakes. But it's also a very helpful tool for you because you can use it very efficiently because you can spot the errors you can correct. It's part of everyday life for lawyers because you do that with your junior lawyers anyway. This is just a lot quicker.
Mhm.
So where lawyers, I think, have gotten into trouble is where they haven't done the checking. So coming back to your questions, that sort of the slow adopters and the very quick adopters, I think you want to have some of your most experienced people, which may be more reluctant to adopt these technology. You want to have them as part of your pilots, as
Mhm.
part of your board, because they actually have very there's no better mitigating factor here than having someone who really knows the topic look over answers when it comes to Gen AI. It's obviously slightly different when you're talking well, actually, when you're talking about predictive stuff as well, having someone who really knows the topic is going to be really, really important. So you have the concept of human oversight in law, in the EU AI Act and elsewhere. And it's very much about having a competent person in the loop, someone who's able to check answers, override it, check, challenge, understand, right?
Mhm.
So I think getting those, and you're not going to want to have a junior person acting like capacity. So I think getting people that are not at the tail end, but certainly well established in their careers and very competent in their domains, I think getting them on board with the AI will actually pay significant dividends. And in my experience, they're usually a little bit more reluctant to get involved. And in terms of other incentives, there's probably some low-hanging fruit where people can test things out, where the risks are not going to be as significant and they're not going to feel as bad. And you know what? There's the interpersonal aspect as well of not knowing how to do something new. So that's not really my field, but certainly that's something you'll want to look at from a culture's perspective, because you could also quite quickly get into quite an inequitable working environment when certain people are making use of AI, but you're not. And that could translate if you're a multinational across different countries as well because of the technology. It is probably better in English than it will be in other languages. So some interesting points there, not necessarily my domain, but adjacent, I think, for your HR and your people team to have a think about. And yes, and how to get people involved, engaged, testing things out in an environment where it's safe to fail, I think is quite important initially, while we're all of us really trying to figure out how to make use of the technology and what kind of use cases are really, really good use cases versus where is it actually quite tricky.
Hmm. Um, Maybe to flip the conversation on its head a little bit here, and let me try and ask this question properly. Um, have there been discussions about the potential risk to not implement AI? Right. So I think most
Mm,
of what we've been talking.
promo, corporate promo.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. Well, exactly. Like many of the other guests that I've had on the podcast who are, you know, pushing or, actually helping businesses implement AI. Maybe they're a little bit biased here, but one of the large messages that I've heard from multiple people is if you're a company today and you don't implement AI, you'll be outcompeted by company B tomorrow who has
Mm,
implemented AI, who has, who knows how to use it, who is using it properly, just because of the efficiency gains that you can get are going to multiply, every member of your staff potentially to be, outputting significantly more work than your company that's not doing that. Is that something that
mm,
comes up in these uh,
ah,
discussions that you're
for
having,
sure.
or is it, yeah.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. But, if that's something you're being told by the person who's selling the service, there's also a
There's
bit
a
of,
bias there. Yeah.
yeah. So I also obviously speak with a lot of different companies in this space, and there is, yeah, I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think building the institutional ability to test things out,
Mm.
I think that's probably where you want to get started and to start thinking about ways of leveraging it. I wouldn't say it's not the case that every company is doing it. In fact, I spoke to a really sophisticated AI developing company, and they were asked the same question on a panel we were on, and the response was, it was quite funny actually. He said it's like sex in high school. Everybody says they're doing it, but nobody really is.
Oh, interesting.
So
Okay.
I think a lot of the time when people are saying they're deploying, they're using AI, they're probably talking about the pilots. They're testing things out.
Mm.
There are some high profile and, large scale projects, and I think they're increasingly common, but I don't think we're at the point where if you don't do it tomorrow, you're gonna fall behind.
Right, right. Okay, okay. Well, very, very
Recently
interesting to
so.
get a different perspective. Yeah. I guess the only other thing mildly attached to this is if, say, ChatGPT 5 or GPT 5.0 comes out, in a month or
Mm,
two, and you've never used ChatGPT, right?
yeah.
And you don't like, oh, what do I do? I actually have ChatGPT open here on one of my other screens. I like conversations. I know the my personal GPTs. Like I understand how the tool works, and if tomorrow this phenomenal new one comes about, I'm already at a higher step, right? If whereas like
Mm,
my sister, for instance, who's never used it, wouldn't know how to start using that. And I guess that's one of the things that all of these I don't want to call it all my guest bias, but a lot of the that are pushing the technology are also mentioning, right? If you're not at the very least familiar with how it works, by the time
mm.
it gets really good, you're going to be a couple steps behind.
That's true, but there's always a lag between getting technology and actually being able to implement it and use it. So at at the moment, and it's probably going to be the case because of the pace of technological development that the technology is going to outpace companies' abilities to figure out how to use it in a sensible way. So I don't. I think that, and it also you do sort of get stuck in echo chambers online, and so I'm sure on podcasts as well, about the small percentage of corporates that are very hot on this and they're following it very closely. Right now, I think the money is primarily in selling the services rather than the profits that are being driven. I mean, I'm sure this is verifiable, right? We should have checked before the podcast, but if we go online and do some research, and actually the people that are making the most money are your KPMGs, your Deloittes, your PwCs, your consultancies. They're selling the dream. And I'm not dissing them for that, but if those are the entities that are making the most money out of it, we're still very much at the figuring it out, I think, approach. So when we start seeing significant dividends from the actual corporates, and it might be the case that we're already there, my info might be a bit dated, and the rate of adoption, I think, is also quite interesting because of the the lag between your globals, your multinationals, and your smaller companies. So I think that's a key concern for a lot of politicians is even if adoption is happening at a sort of public listed company level, it's not trickling down in terms of what we're seeing smaller entities. And there's probably a range of different reasons for that. What data do they have available? Are they able to, do they have the infrastructure to manage these things? So I know that's a concern, that's come up in several different companies is this just a big corporate thing? And it probably is at the moment because they have the ability to manage it. And then getting that to flow through the economy, that's when you start seeing really big improvements. But there's also a lot of hesitancy. So I've been looking over contracts where the standard position is no AI.
Oh, really?
Because yeah, yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So that's also a common position in service delivery and product delivery in MSA, no AI in this. You can use it for your own purposes, for your office efficiencies, for your admin. Don't put it in our products. Don't put it in the services. And you might challenge that and ask, well, why is that the case? And it's not really because they don't know what there is SaaS, they're not prepared to take them. So it's also, I think, going to be a upskilling exercise across the board and getting different teams comfortable with understanding where the risks are. Because until you have a sense of what is the actual exposure we're taking on here, it in lots of industries, there's going to be that reluctance. And then it's going to make it, if you're not allowing it for your suppliers, they're not going to be able to have it with their suppliers. So your processor, sub-processor, that kind of arrangement. So there's a whole supply chain. And then if you don't have the governance processes in place to manage it at a smaller company level, are you then going to be precluded from bidding on larger contracts, for instance? So there's an interesting that whole aspect of your risk perception versus what you're prepared to manage, and your supply chain, I think, will be very interesting. Is one of the concerns that the UK government had in a public consultation that they put out is if we put too many requirements in this list of things you need to do to sell as AI services, does that mean only the big companies are going to be able to bid? And that's regulatory capture is the thing. So where regulations are actually so stringent, only the biggest companies can comply with them. And it's one of the reasons there's been a lot of discussion in Europe around the over regulations, the competitiveness, because what's going to happen is you put in place too stringent requirements, tech companies, they go away, they build their cases, excuse me, in the US and elsewhere, and they build the tech is fully functioning, then they come back and can tweak it around the policies.
Right.
But you've then lost a lot of opportunities for cementing your market for building your own companies. So there's that aspect as well, I think. It's all quite, when you start looking at the macro, the micro, all of these different considerations, it's quite an environment that we're in with such incredibly cool tech, like the potentials, but also the potential risks, and then being able to translate that into application in a way that's sensible, not just for a single company, for the ecosystem that they're in. Um, So yeah, that's lots of things to consider, I think.
Yeah, no, quite a bit. If we shift now a little bit, I mean, we're kind of organically doing this into like the future of what's going to happen
Mm,
here, and also, totally aware of the time here that's counting down. Um, I mean, this is one thing that, I'm over here in Canada. I'm about 10 blocks away from the US border. We live very, very close, so there's obviously a lot of focus on what's happening in the United States. Um, you kind of touched on that. I don't know if we want to open Pandora's box this late in the discussion here, but do you guys see over there in Europe that there is initial waves of reducing a lot of this regulation in order to remain competitive compared to, potentially I mean, we'll see, but potentially what's happening in the United States, who's obviously already very competitive, but it just sounds like they're gonna, slash all these regulations and allow, investment and these AI companies to just go haywire, for better or for worse.
mm. I think it's definitely a concern, and it's uh, we talked about corporate FOMO, and there's also the national
Yes,
level of that,
yes,
right?
yes.
And it is very important. I don't have any answers to the right approach. Um, I think it's not necessarily an evolution of progress with these things. It's an evolution of increasing complexity with the things that you have to consider. And, as a lawyer, I'm very mindful of risks and impacts on individual, but I'm also very aware that, there is the national level to consider. If you're not, competitive in terms of using these technologies, adopting them in your society, building the tools for it, you don't want to be entirely dependent on technologies produced elsewhere. And it has your ability to compete nationally, internationally has an impact on your GDP, your society
Mhm,
fundamentally. So
mhm.
I'm definitely very sensitive to those arguments as well. And I think anybody that says they have it figured out might just have simplified it according to an ideology. So I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, I don't envy the people that are having to make these decisions. I think there's probably some aspects of overregulation. Sorry, that's my son's home. Some aspects of overregulations that we can be in Europe more uh, thoughtful around. My concern is, I would say, more on the public sector use of AI, because you have pretty poor feedback loops and you have pretty poor mechanisms around control. In the private sector, even if you are introducing a bias system, for instance, there should be knock-on effects for that. You're missing out on potential customers, for instance, if we're talking the banking sector. Obviously not great for the individuals, but there should be some kind of feedback mechanism on that happening for the bank. So hopefully it's not something that would continue indefinitely. Versus for public sector use, I do have some real questions around that. And I think that the arguments for having stringent regulations, I think that's fair and I think that's appropriate. In terms of the wider societal aspects for overregulation, competitiveness, I do think Europe has a tendency to go a little bit over the top,
Mm.
in my professional view. I think they are very much of the, uh so just sort of taking a step back, because I'm not talking to a legal audience. You have two different legal mechanisms. You have regulation, which is your extension of your welfare state, essentially, which is preventing the harm before it occurs. And then you have your private law mechanism, which is taking someone to court and suing them. Um, so they're two very different. One is public law or an administration aspect, and the other one is civil, between individuals or individuals and companies. Both will give you an effective legal remedy. So if you have suffered harm and you can sue someone and get compensated, that might be better if we're not talking about something that is so detrimental that no amount of compensation could compensate you.
Right.
Or when we're talking about something that is, will have a really material impact on your life, on your health, things like that. That's fundamentally irreversible, right? But when we're talking about things that can be compensated, you might want to think more about allowing for that private law remedy, which the US is very litigious, so you don't have that kind of tradition, but it's a balancing act, right? So you're either trying to prevent something from happening before it happens, or you're trying to remedy it after the fact. And the law allows for both. So Europe, being very welfare-minded, is quite heavy on the former and quite weak on the latter. So the incentives for taking someone to court, for instance, is not very high because the level of compensation you get is very low, because the state also, or regulators also, don't want to double penalize you. So if you get fined and then you have to pay someone out, it can be quite, if you were to have US level damages, that would be a lot, right?
Right.
So I think in a lot of circumstances, you probably would be better off adopting a little bit more of that model, because you create, like, people will sue you for the harm they care about and not for made up reasons, or like it's like insensitive, because it's just not worth the hassle. Versus in Europe, there's, filing a complaint with a regulator is as easy as sending an email. So for a minor inconvenience, why wouldn't you?
Right.
So I think there's that aspect of it to consider as well. Of course, with AI, there's some unknowns. Is it just too complex for individuals to find out they have suffered the harm? Is it more groups? Is it more distributed across many, many individuals? Potentially, So there's some arguments there as well. But I think, yeah, I think the UK might have taken the best approach, because they're sort of aligned with Europe a little bit. The regulators are quite aware, but they haven't introduced that horizontal regulation. Instead, they've told regulators in each of your different domains, keep an eye on AI, and then we'll see what happens. I think that's probably the better approach, I would have to say. And there's a lot of criticism against the AI Act for not going far enough, for trying that horizontal approach. So for the risks that really matter, they haven't gone, it's not clear enough, it hasn't gone far enough, but they were trying to just cover off everything within one law. And that's potentially the risk of doing that. It won't satisfy anybody.
Very interesting. Yeah, I lived in Europe for about 10 years. So one of the reasons that I moved back here was to start up a business. It seemed a little bit simpler over here than dealing with GDPR issues. I remember when the GDPR thing came about, and we had a little communications / social media team, and they were just, that's all they did for a month or two. That they weren't able to really focus on anything else. So I can kind of perceive the differences between the two worlds, because I've dipped my toes in both sides of the pond, if you will. Yeah, very.
So GDPR is coming back to bite people now, I think, in the age of AI, because you had such stringent requirements around data collection, around how long you can retain information, what you can do with it. You don't have necessarily, I mean, hopefully what you will have is more curated data and better systems for managing it. But you wouldn't necessarily have the data pools or the data sets that you would have in other jurisdictions. And with GDPR, I'm bearing in mind this is my specialism, right? So I probably shouldn't be too negative, but I don't know if it aligns with modern expectations around how data is used at a very fundamental level. So to give you an example, when I gave birth to my son in the hospital, in 2 rooms over, a woman was live streaming the birth of her child. We clearly have very different ideas of privacy around, who should be seeing what people can do with data. But I think that's okay for people to have different views. The problem with having a law like GDPR is that you're not really allowing for people to have, actually, I think it's fine. I don't care what you use my data for. I just want this or that service. And the rationale is clearly, I mean, it's sensible, but how well does it align with modern expectations is the question here, I think, because it is a massive, or it is a large compliance hurdle for most companies to deal with. I've drafted hundreds of privacy notices. I don't think I've ever been in a company that has more than a 0 point something % of people that click on it.
Right.
And so the stated purpose of that one requirement was to give people information about how their data is being used. In any kind of private sector environment where you have a purpose and you have a 0.01% success rate of fulfilling that, or people actually want it, you'd kill it. Like you take it away immediately. So I don't think there's anything wrong with having that kind of transparency, but you could have done it differently. Regulators could have taken sort of an insurance disclaimer approach where it's 3 paragraphs, tell people about the things that you're doing with the data that they're not expecting, that is not an inherent part of the services you're delivering. And I think if you had done that, lots of people would have read it. But they're not reading it, not because they're lazy, but because it's practically impossible. You can't live in modern society and spend. I can't even imagine how long it would take you if you read every privacy notice on every website that you visited.
I mean, that's all you're doing when you're browsing. Yeah, you just view privacy policies. Yeah.
So with terms and conditions, I can understand the rationale a little bit more as a contract, and you can come back to it later. But with the privacy notice, it doesn't fulfill the stated purpose. So here, I think, there's several aspects. The data subject rights, I think they're probably more closely aligned with what people want. The ability to be able to tell companies delete my data and give me my data. Some of the compliance obligations, like the procedural aspect of how to do things, I think if we sort of reflect back, was it worth it? The cost of doing all of those things?
Maybe not.
Yeah, questionable. I think you probably could have done it better. The regulators probably could have done it better.
Well, I mean, our time is a little bit expired here, Erica.
Lots to talk about.
Yeah. No, I'll have to have you back at some point to discuss things further. I don't want to end the episode without giving you the space to talk about, like, if there's anything else you want to talk about the future that you're seeing that's coming with regards to AI compliance. Like, is there anything that, one final message for the audience that they should be thinking about, or have we talked about everything that needs to be discussed?
Gosh, yeah. I think we've covered lots of different things. I think I'm notorious for not being able to give sound bites. My podcast guesting tends to be more like, here are different things you might want to consider. I think fundamentally, people or companies that haven't got started, I don't think you need to worry too much, but I do think it would be sensible to start putting some infrastructure. Definitely don't forget about the legal aspects in place for just allowing people to test things out. And you can do it just organically, like having a pilot program, having something that allows people to dip their toes in. And I think the comment that you made earlier around, even if you're not using it for anything incredibly sophisticated yet, having the confidence and the recognition of how you do or how it works, I think that's a really good idea to get started with.
Perfect. Well, I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much for coming on. It was really enjoyable, and I think also a bit of a different perspective from many of my other guests, which is very useful, so that we don't stay in our little bubbles or bias bubbles, or what the term is nowadays. Erica, I will have your LinkedIn up on the show notes. Are there any other places that, or any other links or anything that I should put in there so that the audience?
LinkedIn is a great place to find me. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Super.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on again. Very knowledgeable, very interesting. And yeah, we'll probably have to reconnect at some point and have you talk about a whole other section of things that you're talking about. So thanks again.
Happy to do so. Thanks, Marc.
Okay, bye. Well, thanks for listening to this week's Future Tech and Foresight podcast. If you like what you've heard here, there are, of course, a number of ways that you can support the podcast. The best way would be to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or give a rating on Spotify, which you can find a step-by-step explanation for on the futuretechandforesight.com website. Alternatively, feel free to leave a comment either on the episode show notes or the YouTube channel, where you can see video recordings of the interviews. And finally, if you are part of an organization that is aware of the disruptive and transformational impact that emerging and future technologies will bring and want to know more, please get in touch to hear about the strategic foresight services that we offer and how we can help future-proof your organization and take advantage of the phenomenal opportunities available to survive and thrive in the future.
A lot of future-shocked people and future-shocked institutions in our society are simply overwhelmed.
Once there is superintelligence,
The fate of humanity may depend on what the superintelligence does.
Science fact is catching up to science fiction.
The first truly intelligent machine will be the last invention that humanity needs to make.
The only scarcity that will exist in the future is that which we decide to create ourselves as humans.
Within a 10-year design revolution, we can have all humanity living the highest standard of living anybody's ever known.
Progress is accelerating at an exponential pace, and it's going to reach a point where progress is so fast it's going to be a singularity.
We are probably one of the last generations of Homo sapiens.
Every single headline points to the birth pangs of a Type 1 civilization.